All right, so we're going to draw this graph. So we're going to be talking a little bit about positive versus negative first. So we're going to put a line on our x-axis. So the line that cuts the grid in half, those are our x values, our x-axis. So anything above the x-axis, we're going to shade in green. And then anything below the red axis, I'm going to put in red. So I just want you guys to label them because you don't have green and red. So we're going to label the top as positive and the bottom as negative. Anything that's above the x-axis is positive. Anything that's below the x-axis is negative. And we only want to use the x value. So we're going to make a note over here that we're only going to use the x values. If I can spell. So we're going to look at each one of these graphs. We have 6 different graphs. We're going to look at where the graph is positive and where the graph is negative. So we're going to look where it's above the x-axis and where it's below the x-axis. So we're going to look at graph number 1. So we're going to go ahead and put our points on our x-intercepts because for positive and negative, this is going to be helpful. So it's positive where it's above the x-axis. So everything up here is positive. So from -3 to +3 is where it's positive. So down here, for graph number 1, our positive interval is from -3 to +3. So we write it just like that. Whatever the starting number is and whatever the stopping number is. And for the positive and negative, we look at the x-intercepts to help us. It's negative from this portion of the graph, it's below the x-axis, and from this portion of the graph, it's below the x-axis. So this is the left arrow. Go ahead and put an arrow on there because that means it's going down forever. So it starts at the left arrow, which we always represent the left arrow as negative infinity, and we always represent the right arrow as positive infinity. So we can draw an arrow on this side as well. So it's negative from negative infinity to -3, and negative from +3 to positive infinity. So this little portion of the graph right here, and this little portion of the graph right here. So we're going to write those down for our negative portions for number 1. So from negative infinity to -3, and from +3 to positive infinity. So we're basically just flipping those for our negative intervals. So here's our x-intercepts for number 2. Okay. Now, it is only above the x-axis. It's always above the x-axis. So from our left arrow to our right arrow, it's always going to be positive. So if it's always positive, that's from -infinity to positive infinity. So that's how we're going to write our positive interval for number 2. But since it's never below the x-axis, it never is negative. It's never below the x-axis, so it's never negative. And that's possible. You might find a couple on your practice where it never goes above or below the x-axis. So that was graph number 2. This is graph number 3. So for graph number 3, we got to find our x-intercepts, which is right here at -4 and 0. So we're going to start with positive. So it's positive from the left arrow all the way down to this point right here. If we trace it, it's still positive until we get to -4. So from -infinity to -4 is where it's positive first. And then the second portion is from 0 to the right arrow. So from 0 to positive infinity. So those are my two positive intervals. So it's below the x-axis from here all the way over to here. So from -4 to 0 is where it's negative. So from -4 to 0 is our negative interval. Our x-intercepts, here's my first x-intercept, here's my second x-intercept. So that's at -1 and +1. So I'm positive from -1 just over to +1. It's just this little portion up here that's positive. From -1 to +1. Then our negative portion, that's the majority of the graph. From the left arrow up to -1, this little side of the graph is negative. So from -infinity to -1. And then from this little point all the way down to the right arrow, so from +1 to the right arrow, which is positive infinity. So far we've had 3 intervals for most of them except for number 2. Here's our x-intercepts. So at -1 and +3. So from -1, if I trace it all the way over to +3, our graph is above the x-axis, so that's where it's positive. -1 to +3. Then we have to do our negative intervals. So from the left arrow over to -1, that's the first portion, -infinity to -1. And then from +3, the x-intercept, to the right arrow is also where it's negative. So from +3 to positive infinity is our second negative interval. And we'll do the same thing for graph 6. Here's our x-intercepts. This time it has 2 positive intervals. So our first positive interval is from the left arrow down to -3. So from -infinity to -3. And then the second one is from -1 to the right arrow. So -1 to positive infinity. So it's always the number of the x-intercept and then either positive or negative infinity. Negative infinity if it's the left arrow, positive infinity if it's the right arrow. And then our negative interval is this little portion down here. So from -3, I trace it over to -1. So our last interval is from -3 to -1. All right, so we're going to start with our first graph. We're going to go back to number 1. I'm going to highlight where it's going up in my color. So I can retrace this. It's going up from here to here. So go ahead and use your color to highlight this part of the graph where it's going up. So this color is going to be where it's increasing. And then I'm going to use yellow for where it's decreasing. So then you're going to take your yellow and you're going to highlight this side of the graph. So the purple is where it's increasing. The yellow is where it's decreasing. So you're going to use your color and your yellow to match mine. So my increasing is all of this purple portion here, from -infinity to this vertex point of 0. So from -infinity to 0 is where it's increasing. And from 0 to positive infinity is where it's decreasing. So we're going to highlight those to label those as well. It's decreasing from 0 to infinity and increasing from -infinity to 0. So go ahead and get those labeled and written down for number 1. Go through and I'm going to highlight all of where it's increasing. So if I trace my graph, I'm going down, down, down. So I only highlight this portion of my graph in my color. This part is going down, down, down. So I only highlight this portion in my color. You're going to go through and do that for every graph. This is where this graph is increasing, so I'm going to highlight this side. This side is my increasing part. If I trace this graph, this side's going down, so I don't start my increasing until right here. So half of them are going to be increasing and half of them are going to be decreasing. Once you have all your increasing highlighted, go ahead and highlight your decreasing. Do that for all the graphs. You're highlighting them to know which one's increasing and which one's decreasing. So it's increasing from 0 to positive infinity and decreasing from the left arrow, negative infinity, back to 0. So notice that the numbers don't change. The numbers do not change for our increasing and decreasing because it starts and stops in the same place. This one is increasing from -2 to positive infinity. This one is decreasing from negative infinity to -2. So it's always the opposite. One is increasing, one is decreasing. Graph number 4, it's increasing from negative infinity to negative 5. From negative infinity to negative 5. And then it's decreasing from negative 5 to positive infinity. It's always the opposite infinity. This one is increasing from negative infinity to positive 1. This one is decreasing from positive 1 to positive infinity. So we just switch it. This one is increasing from -2 to positive infinity. This one is decreasing from negative infinity to -2. You just switch them. So go ahead and get all those negative and positive, increasing and decreasing intervals written down. So on page 63, increasing is where the graph is going up. So we just talked about all of the parts where our graph was going up, and decreasing is when the graph is going down. Okay, so those are the only 2 additional definitions that I wanted to add to our page 63 notes from yesterday.